Thanks,
John
Neil.
is chair of the task force.
Yep, thanks, Neil. All right. Well, why don't I go over a couple of things and then I'll open this up to questions, and I can stay on as long as anybody wants to go through any kind of questions or concerns that you might have about how this is going to work. Let's just start with the schedule really briefly. We won't meet as a task force until after all of the full day presentations are done. So our first task force meeting won't be until May 5th. Well, actually, I take that back. We will meet, so our first actual scheduled meeting that you see on the schedule will be May 5th. However, at the end of each of the full day presentations, we do meet as a committee, or excuse me, as a task force. And our job at that point, if you guys, does everybody have the capital guidelines handy? If you do, take a look at that. If you go to page 9, which is the click rating summary, at the top of that page is project priority. That's the critical, significant, important, desirable. And then down a little further, contribution to city goals, and you see strong, moderate, little. Our job at the end of the first full day presentation will be to consider all of the transportation projects that were presented on that day and categorize them by each of those areas, project priority and contribution to city goals. We'll do that as a committee. And the idea is that all task force members, that's guidance that goes to everyone, and you are strongly encouraged to use the point range that's within wherever we classify them. If you go back about 5 years ago, it was required that you stay within them. We changed that. If someone has strong opinions, they are allowed to go outside of that point range. But that should be something that's unusual, and you should have a pretty good reason for doing it, although no one's going to ask you to defend it because your ratings are private and nobody knows what they are. But it's just sort of the honor system with respect to that. So at the end of the day, we'll go through the transportation task force projects that were brought up. And just real briefly, the way I do that is, since 80% of these projects or more are returning that we've seen before, what I'll do is I'll start with how we rated that project the previous year. That in no way suggests that we have to do the same thing. It's just a starting point. So, and the way we'll do this is I kind of start slowly for people that are new, so you sort of see how things work. You're going to be feeling overwhelmed that day. You'll probably feel overwhelmed through most of this click season. It's just a lot of information that's coming at you pretty quickly, especially when we're doing all of this virtually. And you're at a disadvantage in the sense that returning people have seen these projects before, right? If they're doing this ideally, projects that are new this year are going to be in the 5th or 6th year out, and then you see them every year as they creep closer and closer. It doesn't always work quite that smoothly, but that's the idea. So naturally, most of these projects have been seen before by people that are returning to the committees. So you're at a pretty big disadvantage year 1 and year 2 when you're seeing 120 new projects. So just don't let go. Don't be dragged, right? I mean, it's okay. So we'll do that at the end of the 2 full day sessions. Then we have the up to 3 committee meetings in May, or task force meetings. And that's where we'll discuss comments specific to the transportation task force projects. You come to those meetings ideally with comments that have already been submitted via email. We'll talk more about that when it gets a little bit closer. Just for efficiency's sake, if the comments can be circulated before we actually meet, then if someone's got a concern or an objection, we're not reading comments in the meeting. We've had a chance to review them before we actually get to the meeting is the idea. And again, even though you're on this task force, if you are somebody who's passionate about human development generally, or a specific project or two because it's in your ward or it's just a passion for you, you are in no way precluded from commenting on that project. You just have to write the comment up and make sure you get it over to somebody on the Human Development Task Force, probably either Eric or his new co-chair, Jocelyn. You can do that via email, and they'll consider it. If for some reason you're not able to do that, or it doesn't make it through the committee, all of this gets reviewed by the full committee when we get to that point. So we don't want to have a lot of new comments being introduced at that point because it just slows down our work. But there's nothing that precludes somebody from introducing a comment for the first time after the task force stuff is done. Sometimes something comes up in the way we rate something once we get together as a group, or the way we fund something that requires a comment. So we just don't know till later on about that kind of thing. Or there's discussion that generates ideas that we didn't have previously. So, one thing we really try hard to do on this committee, both task forces and the full committee, is to never silence anybody. So, if you've got a thought and it comes late, we try to find a way to get our work done, but also make sure everybody gets their voice heard. So that's how the task force works. I think maybe it'll be helpful if I go over scoring again. They did that pretty quickly, and there's a few things I'd like to point out that weren't mentioned in the full meeting. So again, if you have that page 9 of the CLIC guidelines, so just if you take a broad view of this, if something got all the points it could possibly get, it would get 300 points. And if you look at the way this sheet is set up, there's 3 sections that are each worth 100 points. So the first one up at the top is a combination of both project priority and inconsecutive previous year budget requests. So just to be clear, you do not have to do anything under inconsecutive previous year budget requests. When you get your score sheet, city staff will have already assigned those points based on that. It's just factual information. If the city has presented that project for the previous 2 years, that project gets 10 points. That's not negotiable. It's just the idea behind that is to encourage city departments to do really good long-term planning, right? If they introduce a project brand new 6 years out and move it up each year, when it gets to that 6th year, it gets 35 points, which is meaningful, right? And that's a change we made from the past. It used to be if it was in the adopted plan. So the problem with that is that's up to the politicians about whether or not they actually want to fund the project, which there's some legitimacy to that. But the idea behind these points is to encourage city staff to do really good long-term planning. So even if their project isn't getting adopted by the politicians, if they're introducing it and putting it before us each year the way they should, the thought was they ought to get those points. So that's how that piece works. You don't have to do anything. That will just show up on the spreadsheet that you'll get when it's time to do your individual ratings. The level of need, again, you'll get guidance there, because if it's a transportation project, we will have already assigned it a level of need, and then all you have to do is use your individual scoring to give it points within that range that you see. You see the minimum and the maximum. So if it was significant, you could give it as few as 41 and as high as 50. And again, if you feel strongly, you are allowed to go outside of that range. And so you'll get the spreadsheet, that spreadsheet that Robert showed briefly. There'll be an X under which level of need it is, and that corresponds to the category that it was classified in, either by HD or transportation. And you convert the X to a specific number of points that's within that range. So moving down from there, the other piece that we'll rate as a task force is its contribution to city goals. So again, there'll be a range there. So if, for instance, if something was rated that it had a strong contribution, you'd have the ability to assign it between 46 and 70 points. Again, you can go outside of that range if you have strong feelings about it, but the idea is that most of the time you want to stay in that range. Operating costs is a little trickier. This changed since the last CLIC session. This used to just be minus 30 to plus 30 points. There was no guidance about how you assign those points. Some capital budget requests, known as CBRs, those are the individual forms that the city staff fill out for each project that has the information that pertains to each project. Some of them are good about giving a lot of detail about whether or not there are additional operating costs or operating cost savings based on each project, and others are not that great about it. What we tried to do, and I don't know if this is going to actually happen on the CBRs this year, is, if a project that has a $100,000 total cost has a $2,000 operating cost savings annually, and another project has $1 million investment and has a $2,000 operating cost savings, those are not equivalent, right? But we had no way of dealing with that. So that's why we're now doing it as operating costs or savings as a percent of the total investment. The problem is I'm not sure the CBRs are going to give that information. So for the finance people and the financially inclined people, that's not a big deal to figure that out. For other people, it may be more of a challenge. So we're going to have to figure out how to address that. And then there's a guidance range there. Those ranges are not firm. It's guidance. You can do this any way you want. I would just go back to what Robert said. What's most important is that however you choose to do this, try to be consistent individually across projects, and don't worry about whether somebody else is doing it differently. I think when you average 33 people's scores, that sort of all comes out in the wash. The most important thing is to do it consistently for yourself. And then finally, the last area is the qualitative criteria. And that, again, that changed this year. We added equity. We combined these into different categories than they used to be in, and changed the points between them. The subtotals, the total for the qualitative area is still 100 points. You know, and it's qualitative, right? So again, I think you just need to find a way to be consistent about how you deal with this across different projects for you individually. And again, you know, whenever you get a numbered rating system like this, it sort of implies a lot more precision than there really is. So I wouldn't get too worried about that. Just come up with a system that works for you, that's consistent across what you do, and I think it all kind of comes out in the wash. And then the last point I would make is, you know, you see this critical, significant, important, desirable. What do those mean? There are specific definitions of those in this capital guidelines. I encourage you to read over those several times. We can chat about those at our first task force meeting after the full day presentation, because sometimes people have slight misinterpretations about that, and even within that, you know, it's qualitative to a certain extent, right? So sometimes people view things slightly differently. It's not all black and white. And so I would encourage you to read the definitions of the project priority and also contribution to city goals. Those two things are the first things you're going to need. You should read all the definitions, obviously, but those two in particular, you're going to need on the first day of full day presentations when we get to doing the ratings at the end of the day. So that's something you can be thinking about too as the presenters are presenting, particularly as it pertains to the transportation projects, is what your thought is about where it falls within each of those categories. And just personally, what I've found is really helpful is sometimes you have a thought on where it ought to be, and then someone speaks up who's in the neighborhood where that project is, and they've got information that wasn't shared by city staff that can change your view about that one way or the other. Either that the neighborhoods have been opposed to the project forever, or they've been asking for it forever, and why, and all that sort of stuff. So I just encourage everybody to be kind of open-minded as, you know, more information comes in about these things. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to entertain questions that anybody might have. I know it's a lot of information that gets bombarded at you.
John, if I could just make a comment here, I would encourage the new members in particular to sort of give a rough scoring for the criteria at the bottom as they're reading through the capital proposal, sort of a very preliminary look. And then once you sit through, as you're sitting through the presentation by the departments, you may modify that. And then when you sit back and hand in your final ratings, it will be another chance for you to change that at the last minute. And I think that waiting till the last week or so to make a rating for all 100 proposals, which you'll be doing, or I guess 120 this year since we're doing a 6-year process, will be sort of overwhelming if you're trying to do it all at once. That's what worked for me in my first year. Steve Brandt here.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, you know, people have different ways of doing this. That's really helpful, the way Steve does it, that, you know, somebody might think, yeah, that's not the way for me to do it. But, you know, as long as you find a way to get this done where you're able to be consistent across the projects, that's the most important thing for everybody, but especially the new people. I would encourage you before the first full day presentation to read through those projects. You'll see on these CBRs, you quickly will learn that there's areas of that. The forms are roughly 5 pages long for each project. There's some information in there that's literally useless. It's boilerplate, and it's the same for all of these. You know, they're asked to say how the project contributes to the city goals. They all become like used car salesmen at that point, right? They figure out a way that you know, all these different ways that it contributes to city goals, and it's not very, and for the most part, they spit back the exact information that's in our guidelines. They don't use their own words. So it's not particularly useful information in my view. Read it for yourselves and make your own decisions, but that's, so you quickly learn where the useful information is in each CBR and where it isn't. And as you go through, after you get through about 10 or 15 of these, you start to know where to go in each CBR to get the relevant information that you need. You know, the first place is that the front page of the CBR is chock full of a lot of good information that's very project specific, that talks about what the project is trying to accomplish and why and those sorts of things. You'll also notice on all of these CBRs that each department will rank the project priority. So if they're submitting 50 projects, they'll rank them 1 to 50. That doesn't mean that because Public Works ranks a particular project number 1, that our project priority needs to be critical. First of all, it doesn't jive with our definitions. Secondly, it's not our job to rubber stamp their views. That's just input that you should take and information that you should take and do with as you see fit. Sonia, go ahead.
How far in advance of the Aldi presentations will we get the CBRs?
I thought I heard them say at the last meeting that those are supposed to be available by the 14th.
They are technically due on the 15th of April.
So they're due on the 15th, they won't be available on the 15th, right?
Yeah, we're still trying to work through with the presentation process with the departments right now. So we did give them like a 16th deadline for like we're hoping to have it like all online on like the 16th.
Will those go onto the CLIC website and we'll be able to review them from there?
Yeah, and we'll send out more guidance on where all those things live in the next couple of days, I think.
Okay. Thank you.
The way that's worked in the past is that they send out a link and it's a big, huge PDF for all 120 of these things, which can be a little bit overwhelming to deal with. And unfortunately, things are a little bit, the last 2 years have been virtual, which has created challenges with all of this. Normally we get a little bit more time than we're going to get this year between when we see the CBRs for the first time and when that first meeting is. Looks like we're going to have about 9 or 10 days this time, which is probably about half of what we normally have. Let's see, I think Dan was next and then Scott.
Okay, I'm going to just suggest something. I know that there's probably a lot of good reasons why not to do it, but I think it would help to ground everyone, and that is to take one CBR as an example and just walk through the entire thing. So that starts with looking at the CBR request, the whole book, how to find it within that, and then taking a look at the 5-6 pages that are there, and then trying to apply that to the scoring sheet. And perhaps that could be done with a project that is not, was completed last year or won't be on this year's this terms, this period. But I think that would help try to set a little bit of where to look and what to be looking at, and perhaps some of the variation that you might see, and then how you would perhaps apply that across projects. Thank you.
Go ahead, Scott, and then Steve.
Yeah, Justin, I just want to clarify. Last year, I was given the 1,200-page PDF, which is kind of a struggle for me to use. I learned well after I had finished all the ratings that there is actually an accessible website that's really easy to use, and I think everybody should have access to this thing. My understanding is it is the CBRs. They all get entered into this accessible website, so it's not extra work.
This would be the OpenGov website, correct? Was that?
I guess so. I don't know what it was. Yeah.
So they, these are really great questions. They do all live on one website, and I'm not sure because I know Robert usually sends out like a folio of all of them, so it must be that 1,200-page like PDF. But yeah, so I think you should all have access at some point to the OpenGov website, and you can like read them through there, and they should be accessible. But I will.
I need that as early as possible because I'm not going to scroll through a 1,200 page PDF this year. So
Okay. Yeah, I will get some more information and talk to the other staff, city staff about that.
okay.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Steve.
In the past, Neil, we've always had until the Thursday before Memorial Day to get our rankings in. This year, it looks like it's about a week earlier than that, and I wanted to check whether there's any possibility of stretching the deadline for the rankings because it is really quite compressed this year. And given that we're operating in the midst of a pandemic where, collegiality does get compressed, it would be helpful to have that extra time.
I think the executive committee would have to make that decision, but I can also follow up and get some more, relay those comments back to the other city staff members.
Steve, the one thing I would say about that is I think maybe traditionally what happens is people miss the deadline. So I think the idea is if you put an earlier deadline and people miss, there's still some space for people to get them in. And it encourages people to sort of work a little more efficiently and quickly. But the reality is there is a point at which we do have to cut it off. And the worst thing ever is to have a committee member not have their rating included. So I think that might be the thought process behind having some squish time that isn't officially called squish time, because then it loses its ability to encourage people to get them in quickly. But that might be something to bring up at our meeting next Wednesday with everyone. Is there anything else that anybody wants to, concerns or questions or? I'm always available. I'm happy to answer questions via email. If someone wants to talk about any of this on the phone, I'll give you my phone number right now. You're welcome to text me or call me. My number is 612-770-9280. I'm happy to answer questions for anybody, or you can do that way or via email at any point. Thor, go ahead.
Yeah. Question on the schedule, because as the calendar keeps kind of moving for me, where new dates keep added on. I just want to make sure I get everything on my schedule as best as I can, because there's quite a bit. Is there a final date where we'll know all the kind of meeting times so that I can get that scheduled in?
The schedule that's out now should be it.
That should be that's our complete list.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, there should not be anything added to that list.
All right. So that was the one that was in the email that just came out.
That's right.
Okay.
And there are some to be determined dates at the very last meeting, but that very last meeting is only for the executive committee. So if you're not on the executive committee, you don't have to worry about that one.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else? Anybody? Well, for those of you who are new, welcome. It's a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun. It's pretty interesting. My first one was 15 years ago, and I mean, I had no idea what went on under the city streets in any city, let alone Minneapolis. And that's a really fascinating part of this, is the stuff you learn about waters and sewers and road construction and road repair and all of those sorts of things. It's really quite fascinating. And in years when we're not virtual, historically in the past, we've been able to do various types of tours of the water treatment plant. So hopefully beginning next year, which will be midterm for all of us, we'll be able to get back to that sort of thing. Dan, I see your hand up. You're muted, Dan.
Depending how things go with the pandemic and everything else, I know it's very doubtful to think about going on a tour this year. But anyways, the East Side Garage, I think, is moving along pretty quickly. That's a project up in Northeast that is a big thing that might be a very open and outdoor way of being able to do a tour together. And just wanted to put that out there in case things get better. Thanks.
A couple years ago, we did the bell tower at the top of City Hall. And the request I've had in, which won't happen this year, but maybe one of these years, is the deep sewer tunnel. Some of those are 70 feet down underground. Anything else for anybody? All right, well, like I said, welcome to Click, or welcome back, and hopefully we'll have a productive and efficient and maybe even fun year with this. And I think with that, we'll end the meeting. And again, if you've got any questions or any concerns, feel free to reach out to me.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Katie, are you on?
I think she dropped off a couple minutes ago.
I was going to give her a chance to say something, but she's not on. So, all right. Bye, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, John.
Thanks. Bye.